Hello, and welcome back to the Sleep Lab. Tonight we are going to explore something happening inside your own skull, right now, every single night, that scientists have only really begun to properly understand within the past few decades, the actual biological machinery responsible for generating the vivid, strange, sometimes beautiful world of your dreams. For most of human history, dreams were treated as something almost entirely separate from the body, a mysterious visitation from beyond, a message from the gods, or later, a kind of symbolic code waiting to be decoded by a psychoanalyst's careful interpretation. What modern neuroscience has gradually, patiently uncovered instead is something considerably more grounded, and in its own way considerably more remarkable, a genuine, physical organ, your own brain, actively, deliberately constructing an entire immersive experience each night using specific, identifiable structures working in careful coordination. Structures researchers have only recently been able to map with real precision using modern brain imaging and clinical case studies. Tonight we're going to walk slowly through 13 genuine, evidence-based facts about exactly which parts of your brain generate your dreams, how they do it, and what recent research has revealed about this remarkable nightly process. Nothing tonight requires any effort from you at all. Just listen, and let your own brain get on with the work of building tonight's dreams, exactly as it always does, entirely without needing your conscious help. It's worth pausing for a moment on just how recent much of tonight's understanding genuinely is, in the grand scope of scientific history. Humans have been dreaming, and wondering about dreaming, for as long as anything resembling recorded thought has existed, with ancient civilizations across the world developing elaborate systems of dream interpretation, religious frameworks treating dreams as messages from beyond, and later, entire schools of psychology built around the idea that dreams encode hidden, symbolic meaning requiring careful, specialized decoding. The actual physical machinery responsible for generating dreams in the first place, the specific brain structures we're about to explore together tonight, has only really come into clear scientific focus within the past several decades, with some of the most significant discoveries covered tonight emerging within just the past 10 or 15 years. This means tonight's episode sits at a genuinely unusual, still unfolding moment in a very long story, arriving considerably closer to the beginning of genuine scientific understanding than to its end, a reminder that even a nightly experience as old and as universal as dreaming still has plenty of room left for careful, patient discovery. If this kind of journey is worth your time, a like, a subscribe, or a thought left below helps this small lab keep its lights on for other sleepy minds finding their way here. But for now, there is nothing you need to do except settle in, let your body grow heavy, and let your own dreaming mind begin its quiet work. Let's begin. Deep within the brainstem, the ancient, evolutionarily older structure connecting your brain to your spinal cord, sits a relatively small region called the Pons, and researchers studying the biological origins of REM sleep, the stage most closely associated with vivid, narrative dreaming, have found that this unassuming structure functions as something close to dreaming's central ignition switch. Specific clusters of neurons within the Pons, researchers have found, become dramatically, measurably active at the precise onset of REM sleep, releasing a cascade of neurochemical signals that ripple outward to activate numerous other brain regions simultaneously, essentially flipping the switch that transitions the sleeping brain from the quieter, less active patterns of non-REM sleep into the considerably more energetic, cortex-wide activation pattern associated with dreaming. This discovery traces back significantly to research conducted by neuroscientists Robert McCarley and Alan Hobson, whose work throughout the 1970s helped establish what became known as the activation synthesis model, proposing that dreams originate not primarily as meaningful, symbolic messages requiring careful psychological interpretation, but as the brain's own attempt to make coherent narrative sense of essentially random neural activation signals originating from the pons and subsequently spreading throughout the rest of the sleeping brain. Clinical case studies involving patients with specific damage to this precise brainstem region have offered genuinely compelling supporting evidence for the pons' central role, with researchers documenting cases in which damage localized specifically to this structure resulted in a near-total loss of REM sleep and, correspondingly, a dramatic reduction or complete absence of reported dreaming, while patients with damage to other, considerably more forward brain regions often continued experiencing largely normal REM sleep and dreaming despite their other injuries, offering researchers a genuinely important, carefully documented clue distinguishing the pons' foundational, ignition-like role from the more elaborative, content-generating work performed by other brain regions we'll explore throughout the remainder of tonight's episode. Hobson and McCarley's original activation synthesis model, while genuinely foundational to the field, has itself continued evolving considerably as newer research tools became available in the decades since its initial proposal, with more recent researchers refining the theory to account for the genuine, well-documented ways dream content does often connect meaningfully to a dreamer's actual waking concerns and memories, rather than being purely random in the way the earliest version of the model sometimes seemed to suggest. Modern sleep researchers generally now favor a more integrated view, treating the Pons as initiating activation as providing the essential biological spark and underlying energetic state necessary for dreaming to occur at all, while other structures we'll explore throughout tonight's episode, particularly the hippocampus and amygdala, contribute the more specific, personally meaningful content that gets woven into the particular narrative any individual dream ultimately takes, a genuinely productive scientific evolution showing how an influential early theory can be thoughtfully refined rather than simply discarded as subsequent research reveals a more complete, nuanced picture. While the Pons initiates the biological state of REM sleep itself, researchers using functional brain imaging to study which specific regions become most active once dreaming actually begins have found that the amygdala, a small, almond-shaped structure deeply involved in processing emotion, particularly fear and threat detection during ordinary waking life, shows dramatically elevated activity throughout REM sleep, often reaching levels of activation exceeding what the same structure typically displays during normal waking hours. This finding offers a genuinely compelling, evidence-based explanation for one of dreaming's most consistently reported features across virtually every culture and individual studied, the strikingly heightened emotional intensity dreams so often carry, whether the vivid, disproportionate terror of a nightmare, or the equally intense, sometimes overwhelming joy occasionally experienced within a particularly pleasant dream. Researchers studying this heightened amygdala activation have proposed that it likely connects directly to a broader theory regarding dreaming's underlying evolutionary and psychological function, sometimes called the threat simulation theory, which suggests dreams, and nightmares specifically, may have evolved partly as a kind of safe, low-stakes rehearsal space, allowing the brain to practice recognizing and emotionally processing potentially dangerous or threatening scenarios without any of the genuine real-world risk such rehearsal would carry if attempted during actual waking life. This same elevated amygdala activity during REM sleep also connects to a well-documented, broader pattern researchers have found regarding dream emotional content more generally, with large-scale studies collecting and analyzing thousands of dream reports consistently finding that negative emotional content, including fear, anxiety, and frustration, tends to appear somewhat more frequently within reported dreams than clearly positive emotional content, a pattern researchers believe reflects the same amygdala-driven emphasis on threat-related processing operating quietly throughout the night, shaping the emotional texture of dream experience even when the specific narrative content itself might otherwise seem entirely unrelated to any genuine source of real-world concern. Researchers studying this pattern have also found genuinely interesting evidence regarding how the amygdala's heightened dream state activity might connect to broader emotional health and resilience more generally, with several studies finding that individuals who experienced a genuinely stressful or emotionally difficult event during their waking day showed measurably reduced amygdala reactivity to similar emotional content the following day, but only if they had experienced adequate REM sleep in the intervening night. A finding researchers interpret as evidence that this same heightened overnight amygdala activity may serve a genuine emotional regulation function, essentially allowing the brain to process and gradually diffuse the intensity of a difficult emotional experience during sleep, in a way that leaves a person somewhat better equipped to handle similar emotional content the next day, offering a genuinely compelling, evidence-based explanation for why a full night of quality sleep so often leaves emotionally difficult experiences feeling meaningfully less overwhelming than they did the previous evening. One of the most genuinely striking, well-documented findings in modern dream research involves what happens to the prefrontal cortex, the brain region located directly behind the forehead responsible for logical reasoning, careful planning, working memory, and the kind of critical, reality-checking judgment that ordinarily helps a waking mind recognize when something doesn't quite make sense. Neuroimaging studies conducted during REM sleep have consistently found that activity within the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, specifically, a subregion particularly associated with this kind of deliberate, effortful, logical reasoning, drops substantially compared to typical waking levels, a finding researchers believe offers a remarkably direct, physiologically grounded explanation for one of dreaming's most universally recognized features, the way dreams so often unfold with a bizarre Illogical narrative structure, featuring impossible scenarios, sudden unexplained scene changes, and a general absence of the kind of careful, skeptical questioning that would immediately flag such events as impossible during ordinary waking consciousness. This same reduced prefrontal activity also connects directly to a related, frequently studied phenomenon researchers call dream amnesia, the well-documented tendency for even genuinely vivid, memorable dreams to fade rapidly from conscious memory within just a few minutes of waking, since the prefrontal cortex plays an important, active role in properly encoding new experiences into durable, retrievable memory, meaning its reduced activity throughout the dreaming state likely contributes directly to why dream content proves so notoriously difficult to hold on to and accurately recall once a person fully wakes and the same brain region resumes its normal, more active waking function. Researchers studying lucid dreaming, the relatively rare experience of becoming consciously aware that one is dreaming while the dream itself continues, have found genuinely interesting supporting evidence for this broader picture, with neuroimaging studies of confirmed lucid dreamers finding measurably increased prefrontal cortex activity specifically during the lucid portions of their dream experience compared to ordinary, non-lucid REM sleep, suggesting the very capacity to recognize a dream as a dream while its happening appears to depend directly on this same rational, reality-checking brain region becoming at least partially, unusually reactivated during what would otherwise remain its typical, dream state quiet period. This connection between prefrontal activity and lucid dreaming has generated genuine, practical interest among researchers exploring whether lucid dreaming might be deliberately trainable through specific techniques, with several studies finding that certain practices, including regularly performing what researchers call reality checks throughout waking hours, habitually pausing to consciously verify one's surroundings are genuinely real, appear to measurably increase the frequency of subsequent lucid dreaming experiences, presumably by strengthening the same underlying habit of critical, reality-testing cognition that the prefrontal cortex would then be more likely to spontaneously reactivate during an actual dream. Some researchers have also explored more direct approaches, including mild electrical brain stimulation targeted specifically at frontal brain regions during confirmed REM sleep, with preliminary research finding this technique can, in a meaningful proportion of study participants, successfully induce lucid awareness within an otherwise ordinary dream, offering genuinely compelling, direct experimental support for the specific causal role prefrontal cortex activity appears to play in this particular, well-studied dream phenomenon. Among the more genuinely recent additions to scientific understanding of dream generation involves the claustrum, a thin, sheet-like structure tucked deep within the brain whose function remained largely mysterious for considerably longer than many of the other structures discussed throughout tonight's episode, in part because its unusual thinness and widespread connections throughout the brain made it genuinely difficult for earlier generations of researchers to study using older imaging and mapping techniques. Neuroscientist Francis Crick, better known for his earlier, foundational work co-discovering the structure of DNA, spent much of his later career specifically focused on trying to understand the claustrum's function, proposing in research published shortly before his death that this small structure might play a genuinely important role in binding together information from numerous separate brain regions into a single, unified conscious experience, functioning somewhat like a conductor, coordinating different sections of an orchestra into one coherent musical piece rather than a collection of separate, disconnected instrumental parts. More recent research building on this foundational work has found genuinely compelling evidence suggesting the claustrum may play a directly relevant role specifically during dreaming, given how heavily dream construction depends on rapidly, seamlessly integrating fragmented sensory images, emotional signals from the amygdala, and stored memories into what feels, from the dreamer's own subjective perspective, like a single, continuous, if often bizarre, narrative experience. Researchers studying patients with rare, documented claustrum damage have found some genuinely intriguing supporting clinical evidence, including case reports describing altered or diminished conscious awareness following injury localized specifically to this structure, findings that, while still relatively limited in number and requiring further research to fully establish, have encouraged sleep researchers to consider the claustrum a genuinely promising, actively investigated candidate for helping explain exactly how the sleeping brain manages to weave together its often wildly disparate raw material, fragments of memory, spontaneous sensory activation, and surging emotion into the singular, felt experience of a unified dream. Crick's original interest in the claustrum reportedly emerged, according to colleagues who worked alongside him during his later career, partly from his broader, long-standing fascination with what philosophers and neuroscientists call the binding problem, the genuinely difficult, still not fully resolved question of how a brain composed of countless separate, specialized regions, each processing a different narrow slice of sensory or cognitive information, somehow manages to combine all of that fragmented processing into the single, seamless, unified stream of conscious experience a person actually feels moment to moment, whether awake or dreaming. The Claustrum's unusually extensive, widespread connections reaching into nearly every other major region of the brain made it a genuinely compelling anatomical candidate for playing some central coordinating role in solving this broader puzzle, and while research into its precise function continues actively developing even now, years after Crick's original proposal, the claustrum remains one of the more genuinely active, closely watched areas of ongoing neuroscience research specifically relevant to understanding consciousness and dreaming alike. Even though your eyes remain closed and genuinely unable to receive any actual external visual information throughout sleep, researchers studying brain activity during REM sleep have found that the visual cortex, the brain region normally responsible for processing incoming light and constructing your conscious experience of sight during waking hours, becomes measurably, genuinely active during dreaming, essentially generating vivid visual imagery entirely from the brain's own internal activity, rather than any actual external light signal. This finding helps explain why dreams so consistently, overwhelmingly feature vivid visual content for the vast majority of sighted dreamers, with studies collecting detailed dream reports finding that visual imagery appears in the overwhelming majority of recorded dream experiences, considerably more consistently than any other single sensory modality represented within dream content. Researchers studying this internally generated visual activity have found particularly compelling supporting evidence through studies of blind individuals, discovering a genuinely striking pattern connected directly to when a person originally lost their sight, with individuals who became blind after roughly the age of 7, once their visual cortex had already developed and matured through years of genuine visual experience, generally continuing to report visual imagery within their dreams. Throughout the rest of their lives, while individuals blind from birth, or blinded very early in childhood before their visual cortex had the opportunity to develop through actual visual experience, typically report dreams composed of other sensory content instead, including sound, touch, smell, and emotion, but genuinely lacking any visual component whatsoever. This distinction offers genuinely compelling evidence that dream imagery isn't simply generated from nothing by some abstract, disembodied imagination, but depends directly on the same physical visual processing machinery a person's brain originally used, or in the case of those blind from birth, never had the opportunity to fully develop and use, during genuine waking visual experience, meaning dreaming quite literally borrows and repurposes the very same neural hardware ordinarily dedicated to processing actual, external sight. This same research pattern extends genuinely interestingly to other senses as well, with researchers finding that congenitally deaf individuals typically report dreams containing correspondingly little or no auditory content, while individuals who lost hearing later in life, after their auditory processing regions had already developed through genuine hearing experience, generally continue experiencing sound within their dreams much as they did before losing their hearing. This cross-sensory pattern offers genuinely strong, converging evidence for a broader principle researchers have found holds consistently across nearly every sensory modality studied, that dream content draws directly and specifically on whichever particular sensory processing systems a person's brain actually developed through genuine lived experience, rather than dreams somehow generating entirely novel sensory content from some independent, purely imaginative source unconnected to a dreamer's own actual sensory history and development. As discussed in an earlier Sleep Lab episode exploring the body's overnight processes more broadly, the brain actively, deliberately paralyzes most of the body's voluntary muscles throughout REM sleep, a state researchers call REM atonia, and recent research has increasingly focused on precisely identifying which specific brain structures are directly responsible for generating and maintaining this genuinely essential protective mechanism. Researchers have traced this atonia-generating function to specific neural circuits within the brainstem, particularly a region called the sublatorodorsal nucleus, working in coordination with other nearby structures to actively, continuously suppress signals that would otherwise travel from the brain's motor cortex down through the spinal cord to activate the body's actual muscles, essentially maintaining a deliberate, ongoing communication blockade between the dreaming brain's motor intentions and the sleeping body's physical muscles for the entire duration of REM sleep. This discovery carries genuine, direct clinical importance, since researchers studying the rare, recognized condition called REM sleep behavior disorder have found that this specific brainstem mechanism appears to malfunction or fail in affected patients, allowing dreamers to physically, sometimes dramatically act out their dream content, occasionally resulting in genuine injury to themselves or a sleeping partner nearby. What makes this research particularly significant beyond its immediate clinical relevance is a genuinely important connection researchers have identified between REM sleep behavior disorder and certain neurodegenerative conditions, with longitudinal studies finding that a meaningful proportion of patients diagnosed with this sleep disorder later go on to develop conditions including Parkinson's disease, sometimes years or even decades following their initial sleep disorder diagnosis, suggesting the specific brainstem structures responsible for maintaining healthy REM autonomia may be among the earliest brain regions affected by certain neurodegenerative disease processes, offering researchers a genuinely valuable, if sobering, early warning signal that has opened an entirely new AV.